Good evening, you're watching The Big Story. I'm Haryanto Diman coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. Coming up on the show, we have Malaysia Bureau Chief Shatnan Teo with the latest updates in the lockdown situation in Malaysia. But first, a PCF Sparkle Talks teacher has tested positive for Covid-19 yesterday. The centre at Block 126 Fenchan is closed today for thorough cleaning and disinfection of its premises as an added precautionary measure. The Health Ministry is conducting contact tracing and barring further developments, classes and programs will resume tomorrow. Meanwhile, heeding the Health Ministry's recommendations for greater protection of more vulnerable groups, senior citizens, pregnant women and those with disabilities will get their own dedicated shopping hour at FairPrice stores. The initiative will be held every Monday during the first hour of each FairPrice store's normal operating hours. For stores that operate 24 hours, the dedicated shopping hour will be from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. This begins from next Monday, 30th March. Singapore saw 54 new coronavirus cases yesterday, the highest spike recorded in a day. Of the new cases, 48 are imported, and all but one were returning residents and long-term pass holders. This new record of the highest single-day spike came amid the government's announcement that anyone entering Singapore must submit an online health declaration before proceeding with immigration clearance. Yesterday, the Health Ministry also closed the cluster from the Life Church and Missions and the Grace Assembly of God Church as it was no longer active. 33 patients were linked to the cluster. The total number of infected cases here stands at 509. 15 are in critical condition. 8 more cases have been discharged yesterday, meaning 152 have fully recovered. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund said it sees this crisis causing a global recession this year that could be worse than the global financial crisis of 2008-09. But the world economic output should recover next year. Regardless, this pandemic has taught many lessons and more to come, said Associate Editor Ravi Velloor. Now I have Ravi now to share more on his commentary piece. Welcome, Ravi.
Good evening. Good evening.
Now, Ravi, in your piece, you talked about the 1996-97 financial crisis, also known as the Asian flu. Now, having gone through that period, how is the current crisis any different from then? Back then, it was just a financial crisis, but this time, it's a double whammy, health and financial crisis.
That's right. It's multiple crises coming together at the same time. But I spoke about the Asian flu, partly because to show that what contagion was all about. And we got a first hint about it back in 96, 97. As you know, the Chinese, they devalued the currency in 94, the yuan. And for a couple of years, it took Asia to realize what had happened and the impact began to come through. In January of 97, Hanbo Steel in Korea collapsed. So that was the first indication that things were going to turn dire. And then speculators started attacking Asian assets. And by July, the Thai baht had crumbled. And that set off the financial contagion across East Asia, devastating economies and countries. So in that sense, we see a bit of a similarity here because this contagion too, happened to spread from China. I'm not saying they're responsible for it, but it did happen that it spread from China, and maybe they were a bit slow to alert the world to it. So the similarity is, in a sense, superficial, but there are also some broad things that you could draw parallels with. But then we had other crises also in Asia. But this one is interesting because it's really a health contagion that is now turning into an economic crisis as well, but something that began as a health crisis.
Ravi, in your piece also you mentioned some countries are doing well, some countries are not so well in managing these crises. Which are the countries, in your opinion, are handling the crisis well?
Well, I think to begin with, you have to give credit to the Chinese in having accomplished what they say they have. I think it's largely accurate to say it's been more or less contained in China. Although it's not easy, given that this is a huge nation. There are 60 cities in China which have populations of between 1 million and 20 million. So it's not that I don't think it's completely possible to eradicate it, but to a large extent they managed to handle it and give them credit to it. If you look at Russia, which has a big border with China, and if you look at the Russian landmass, it's really a nation. Russia has managed to get away with just one death. But these two countries aside, I think when you look around, look at Singapore itself. Early in the crisis, it was said, I mean, it was the numbers indicated that we had the second largest number of cases outside of China. But today we're not even in the top 30. And I think that's been a really credible achievement by the Singapore government and the Singapore people, who I think have responded very well to the challenge and responded to the government's initiatives and warnings. And I think together they pulled off quite a good job, despite the numbers currently.
And Ravi, I have to ask in the same vein then, which countries are you concerned about in terms of managing the pandemic?
Well, in our neighborhood, Jan, I would start with Indonesia. I'm really bothered. I'm really worried about Indonesia because, the sheer size of that country. It's so sprawling. The public health facilities are not anywhere close to what they could be. So in this region, it would be Indonesia, but slightly away from us within the Indian subcontinent. I'd be most worried about Pakistan to begin with, and then India.
Now, Ravi, how do you think countries can bounce back from this current crisis? Let's take a look at the financial crisis in 96, 97. Do you expect the recovery course to be similar to that of the financial crisis?
Well, I think the crisis of 96, 97 was very severe, but it was also a U curve. The dip was very, very alarming. And I myself, I learned new phrases like dead cat bounce and all that. Now, what's a dead cat bounce? It's when the stock market falls one day severely and then seems to pick up the next day, but the following day it falls again. And every time a new low is reached. So, I mean, I learned new phrases like dead cat bounce that time. And this time we're also seeing something similar in the markets, the way they're not responding. In fact, three times the US Fed have come in with strong stimulus measures, but the markets have not responded well. They, in fact, fallen. So we are in a new situation where we're not exactly clear, we're not certain where this could all go. So it's too early to say when the curve will flatten, when the recovery will come. But I'm fairly confident that whenever the recovery comes, and that will happen when either a new drug is discovered and is manufactured in sufficient quantities to be used in the affected places, and people begin to have something of a normal life. At that point, the recovery will come and it will be very strong.
Ravi, just to round out our discussion today, I just want to pick up on the point where you mentioned it is a new world that we are going to venture in. Now, what do you envision the world would be post this COVID-19 in terms of economics, social, and even political even?
Well, you're right, Jan. I think we're going to be, what we are going to be next year is going to be quite a lot different from what we were last year. I think if you look at the US-China equation, for instance, I don't see it getting any better. In fact, it could get worse. And possibly, I think you might see an increase in Chinese influence. This happened in 97. Although the Chinese devaluation in 94 in some senses caused the Asian financial crisis of 96, 97, China won a lot of credit for not devaluing when every other currency was devaluing in Asia. They held the line on the yuan and thereby helped a lot of East Asian countries recover and bounce back. Similarly, even this time I'm seeing China get a lot of credit I think that will translate to a lot of goodwill for China. In Europe, for instance, the Germans were seen as the leaders of Europe, but they've been missing in action this time. When Italy needed help, Germany was nowhere. And I think people are going to draw lessons. On the politics, on geopolitics, you're going to see changes. Society, you're going to see changes. I think society will be more, I think it's been a big lesson for a whole lot of people to cut their individualism and to see themselves as part of a commune, a global commune, and that means that you have to work for each other and work with each other. And finally, on the politics, I think there's going to be discussions on the merits of particular political models. I did say in my piece that Italy has had more than 60 governments since 1945. China has had one party ruling all this time. People are going to draw lessons from that. There will be discussions. Look at America, for instance. It's floundering under Donald Trump. America led the war during the Ebola crisis. When the Asian tsunami took place in 2004, 2005, the Americans were here, the Sixth Fleet or the Seventh Fleet, whatever it is, they were here to help us out. Today, the Americans are nowhere in the picture. They're so confused themselves. They can't even get stimulus packages past Congress because the Democratic Senate will not work with the Republican president. They're in such a mess. So I think the world is going to draw lessons from all this, and I think it's going to be significant for Asia going forward.
Well, thank you so much, Ravi. Certainly there is a lot to learn from this whole COVID-19 episode. And that was Associate Editor Ravi Velloor, who shared about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and how affected countries can recover from the crisis. On to the latest COVID-19 situation around the world, starting with the UK. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Monday ordered Britons to stay at home as part of their new lockdown measures. Now, this comes after advice to stay at home and avoid social gatherings when unheeded by millions during the weekend. In a televised address to the nation, Mr. Johnson said the British people were only allowed to leave their homes for basic necessities. He added that the police will be enforcing these new rules through fines and dispersing gatherings. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization warned that the coronavirus pandemic is clearly accelerating, but it was still possible to change the course of the outbreak. They called for the use of more aggressive and targeted tactics, emphasizing that we are not helpless bystanders. Italy has banned travel within the country in yet another attempt to slow the virus spread. This comes after the country reported 651 more deaths on Sunday. The total death toll in Italy is now over 6,000, with close to 64,000 infected cases. The Health Commission for China's Hubei province said it will remove all travel restrictions in and out of Hubei on March 25th. This is excepting the city of Wuhan, where travel restrictions will be lifted on April 8th. And just across the causeway, Malaysia will likely see an extension of its ongoing movement curbs. The decision, to be made by next Monday, will be based on whether there is a reduction in infection cases. The government will also unveil a second stimulus package following last month's 20 billion ringgit injection. The country saw its biggest daily increase with 212 new infections yesterday. This brings the number of those infected to over 1,514 deaths. I'm now joined by Malaysia Bureau Chief Shannon Teo. Now, Shannon, what is the likelihood of an extension of the movement curbs?
I'd say the likelihood is pretty high. I mean, Prime Minister Muhyiddin said that if the numbers are decreasing, then maybe they will consider it. But as long as they're increasing, then they would look at an extension. I mean, the guidance that is given by him, most people are taking the message that we're going to look at the RMO extending until April now. How long? He indicated that they would decide on whether 1 week more or 2 weeks more, but many experts are saying you need at least a month or two before you can contain the entire epidemic that is happening in Malaysia.
Now, Shannon, in the event, say, it were to be extended, what would it entail? Would the government, say, impose stricter rules?
Right now, the government's been saying Malaysians are not complying to the RMO enough. They've started off at 60% compliance. Now they're saying it's about 90%. Well, the army's rolled out, so that maybe people are complying a bit more. But what it would entail would be, well, as we mentioned, the situation will continue. Borders will continue to be closed. Non-essential businesses will still be shut down. And moreover, they're starting to talk about certain hotspots, places which have a lot of cases. I think they're defining it as districts with more than 40 cases. They might come under more scrutiny, more roadblocks, more security measures, trying to make sure that in those areas where there's been a lot of infections, that there's a lot less human contact. So we might see stricter measures, but I don't think we're at a stage where we might see the same kind of lockdowns you've seen in China.
Right. Now, Shannon, let's talk about, say, the impact that this extension would, affect. And what sort of economic impact would Malaysia and the people see if the extension happens?
Well, even right now, we are seeing that people are losing income. We just got some statistics from the Social Security Department. They are seeing even higher claimants for employment insurance than last year, and the trajectory we're getting at for March, they're looking at 80% more claims than last year. So people are losing jobs, right? People don't have sources of income, but in a sense, because businesses are closed, they can't operate. Economic time in Malaysia has paused, right? But financial time, the bills keep racking up. Your rents, your loans, stuff like that. The bills still need to get paid. So Malaysians are finding that money is coming out of our pockets, but nothing's coming back in. So there's a segment of the population that is really struggling, and for them to last another 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, nobody knows how long this is going to go for. They're really going to struggle to put food on the tables.
Yeah. Now, Shannon, of course, we see this impact on the Malaysians in Malaysia. Now, let's focus on the Malaysians who are working in Singapore. If there is an extension on it, do you reckon that these people will be affected as well? And if so, how?
Well, I think the agreement between the two governments, now I don't know the fine print, but it's that the workers will be allowed to stay in Singapore and continue to work for their employers if they don't come back. So if this RMO is extended, my sense is that they will be allowed to continue living there. Now, whether their employers or whoever's providing them with lodgings can continue to do so is a question that remains to be answered. But clearly what we know is that before they return, they need to be given a clean bill of health. They have to be scanned, coronavirus and all that stuff. So whether they have to be sent back halfway or they stay on for the full term, that's unclear. But clearly, if they've caught something while they're in Singapore, they won't be allowed back.
Yeah. And Shannon, on to measures now. What are some of the measures, that have the government put in place to help the country and the people?
So we talked about the 20 billion stimulus package that was in place before. Now, that came in before the current restrictions, and that was largely targeted at the tourism industry. So that 20 billion was mainly geared towards keeping the economy afloat, trying to soften the impact of the global outbreak. But with the situation in Malaysia now, it's basically become about people. The criticism of the government, it's done 2 interim measures so far, is that the measures seem to still be geared towards that, towards making sure that the economy is good, and also towards making sure that the government's own balance sheet is fine. But the criticism is that it's not going to the people who need it the most. I'll give you an example. Last week, the government announced that it would be subsidizing electricity by the tune of 500 million ringgit. But 80% of electricity used in Malaysia is by businesses, not individual households. So 400 million out of these 500 million is going to firms, is going to businesses, right? And they're large, and usually it's going to go to large-scale businesses. That's the one that's using a lot of electricity. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that Malaysians will be able to draw on their EPF, which is similar to Singapore's CPF, up to 500 ringgit a month for the next 12 months. That's 6,000 ringgit per worker. And this is going to be available to 12 million workers who have this money in their EPF accounts. And it's going to result in 40 billion ringgit going in of liquidity going into the market. But again, the criticism, A, it's actually taking away from retirement funds, and B, not everyone has this money to withdraw. It's going to be largely the middle class and the wealthy who have this money to withdraw. So still, what happens to the poorer people are estimating about 4 million who don't have this EPF funds to draw on. 4 million is also about the number of freelancers in the market who have completely lost their income during these 2 weeks because they have no way to actually service their clients or do whatever it is that they do in the gig economy. So the government measures are still missing out on this big chunk of people. And that's what we are hoping for the government to address next week when it launches a full comprehensive stimulus package. But that remains to be seen. The government is now taking suggestions from the public. I understand the window closes tomorrow on the wish list, as it were. Until Monday, we have to hope for the best.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shannon, for your insight. Certainly, it remains to be seen what will be announced this coming Monday. And that was Malaysia Bureau Chief Shannon Teo on whether the extension of the movement curbs is likely to happen in Malaysia. Now, rounding up today's show, the International Olympic Committee has decided to postpone the Tokyo 2020 Summer Games because of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, Australia and Canada withdrew their participation yesterday as organisers came under global pressure to postpone the event for the first time in its 124-year modern history. IOC added a one-year postponement looked like the best solution. Now, this means that the Games are likely to be held in summer next year. Those are our top stories for today. For more news and videos, do log on to straitstimes.com. Once again, I'm Haryanto Diman. Join us tomorrow for more stories on The Big Story.